record with the Campbell County Historical Society, and today this presentation will be Daniel Boone, His Return to Kentucky, by William Stolz. This is the story of the last 45 years of his life and his return to Frankfurt. Thank you.
It's early, we'll go ahead and start. He said he's got a third program, and then we'll get all questions. I'm Jim Duval with the Boone County Historical Society and on the Planning Commission. So I'm going to introduce our speaker. It's William Stolz. He is the Kentucky History Librarian at Kenton County Library, and he's also in charge of the, ma'am, there's a couple of seats up here. Ma'am, there's several over here. He's in charge of the genealogy department, and as you know, that's a very extensive department there. It's one of the best. So we'll introduce him, and he's got a PowerPoint presentation for us.
So I have a fun presentation today. It's Daniel Boone, The Journey Home, and this is a painting of Daniel Boone in his first view of Kentucky. And I do have a disclaimer today. I am not a Daniel Boone expert. I originally got involved in Daniel Boone in 2009. I was living in Boone County, Missouri, and the public library asked me to do a presentation for his 275th birthday. It's hard to believe, so I did that, and in doing the research about his life, I came across this controversy between Missouri and Kentucky that is even ongoing today. So we'll learn all about that, but I just wanted to make that disclaimer before we get going. So Daniel Boone and our culture, when we think about Daniel Boone, we think about pop culture. He pops up everywhere. We think about the coonskin cap, which is a myth. He did not wear a coonskin cap. Sorry to disappoint. But board games, Fess Parker, toys. If you Google Daniel Boone, you pop up with all this stuff that's not really related to Daniel Boone. But it's become part of all of us. When we all think of Daniel Boone, who do we think of first? Fess Parker, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone. So he was on television from about 1965 to 1970. Daniel Boone had a show, and as a treat, I will play the opening. And if you're very good today, at the very end, we'll hear Fess Parker sing the Daniel Boone theme song. And you look closely, this is Kentucky in the background where it was filmed with the rugged mountains.
I think we dropped the blinds halfway.
So who was Daniel Boone? He was born in 1734. You see the two different birth dates? It wasn't until the 1750s that England adopted the modern calendar, so they added dates to his birth, so he went from October to November to make up for the new calendar. He was born in Pennsylvania. He and his family moved to North Carolina in 1750. He marries Rebecca Bryan on August 14, 1756. And what I really find fascinating about Daniel Boone is the amount of travel he did by foot. 1765, he walks to Florida. He had heard about Florida. He wanted to see what it looked like, maybe a place to move to. Got down there, didn't like the beaches, came home. He hears about the Kentucky Territory. So in 1767, he heads over here. And what is just fascinating is that in 1769, he comes back for 2 years. Does anybody do backcountry camping? You think Gore-Tex, tents, freeze-dried food. He did it without that. I mean, he lived off the land for 2 years, he and his brother and friends, and it's just hard to fathom today, you know, with air conditioning, heat, beds and everything, that you could spend 2 years in the environment, but he did. 1775, he blazes the Wilderness Road, settles Boonesboro, and he was still sort of a minor figure, and then in 1784, a guy who actually helped settle Cincinnati, John Filson, publishes an appendix in a book called The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone that makes him a celebrity for the first time. And for the rest of his life, he's really one of the early rock stars of American history that we'll see today. 1792, Kentucky becomes a state, and then in 1799, he heads west to Missouri.
Do you know why he moved there?
We'll get there.
Oh, okay.
Good question. So he and Rebecca have 10 children. And to me, Rebecca's the unsung hero of the Boone family. And she raised all of these children virtually by herself for many years. He would disappear at one point. They thought he was dead. But she took care of the children, took care of the homes. They moved repeatedly throughout their lives, often with little or no money. They continued to move up until they were in their 60s and 70s. And the sad thing about both the Boones is they outlived 5 of their children. And you can see where the children are all buried. They're either in Kentucky or Missouri. And what did Daniel Boone look like? Lyman Draper actually interviewed his youngest son, Nathan, who provided a description of Daniel Boone. And this is great because you can see what he actually looked like. He wasn't the 6'4" Fess Parker that we all envisioned. But he was about 5'8", broad shoulders, usually weighs about 175 pounds. At one point he weighed 200 pounds. Blue eyes, had fair skin. He never used tobacco and was temperate in everything he did. And here he's 1775. This is George Kell Bingham, a Missouri artist, does a depiction of him coming down the Wilderness Road. Rebecca's on horseback. So in 1779, he and his family, where are you going? They're living up here in the Little Sandy in Greenup County. By the 1790s, Boone had been all over. At one point, they were living in Virginia, which is now modern-day West Virginia. In the 1780s and 90s, he'd been involved in land speculation. He'd bought up hundreds of thousands of acres of land in Kentucky. When it became a state in 1792, land claims, taxes, he started having to go to court about the land claims. He worked as a surveyor for many years. People would often claim the same piece of property, and he would have to testify as the surveyor. When you own a couple 100,000 acres of land, you have to pay taxes to the county and to the state, so he would have to sell land in order to pay taxes on other pieces of land. By the 1790s, they're broke, they're living up on Little Sandy, and they're just trying to figure out what to do, where to go. And what's really interesting, in 1798, the state legislature decides to name a county after him, Boone County, but at the same time, Mason County issues a warrant for his arrest for a failure to pay in court. So he decides it's time to pack up. So he and the family, they hear about this place called the Missouri Territory. And I should mention, by 1800, there are roughly 75,000 people living in Kentucky, so for Daniel Boone, it's very crowded. There's a place, the Missouri Territory, west of the Mississippi. There are less than 6,000 Americans living in that vast territory. It's still owned by the Spanish. So he thinks, wouldn't that be a great place to go? So they find this 50-foot tree, cut it down, and they build a canoe, and the family goes down the Ohio towards the Mississippi, and he and some friends take cattle on the south side. Okay,
Too well.
is this better?
Louder, louder.
Okay, I'll try to project even more. So 1799, they go down the Ohio River by canoe. Modern technology. So in a famous quote attributed to Daniel Boone, I trace it back as far as 1856. Supposedly, even though he was on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River, he supposedly got to Cincinnati, which at that time had 850 people. There was no Kenton County. There were about 100 people living in Newport, so a very rural, rugged area still. But supposedly he crossed the river, went to a tavern somewhere in Cincinnati, and told people, asked him why he was going west, and he said, too many people, too crowded, and he wanted to go to new open lands. But the big question is, which Boone was the first Boone in Missouri? There's a whole area of Missouri now. Central Missouri encompasses about 6 counties called Boone's Lick. That is one of the best growing areas in Missouri that's named after the Boone family. But the question is, which Boone should this be named after? Actually, the first Boone in Missouri was Daniel Morgan Boone, one of his sons. He was born in 1769. He married Sarah Lewis. 1797, he goes west looking for land for the family to settle, and he speaks to the Spanish officials, and they say, if you bring your family to the Missouri Territory, we'll give each man 600 arpents, about 500 acres. And if your father, Daniel Boone, comes, because they knew if Daniel would bring people with his name, we'll give him 1,000 arpents, which is about 850 acres of land. And so he says, I'll go home and talk to my dad, and we'll see. He was an explorer and surveyor like his father, served in the War of 1812. Later on in life, he was a farm instructor in Kansas for the Kaw Indians, and he's buried in Jackson County in Missouri on the western side of the state. And there's Nathan Boone, a very happy-looking fellow. All his pictures, the 2 pictures I've seen of him, he looks this way. But interestingly enough, when the family was going down the Ohio towards Missouri, he was interested in a girl named Olive Van Bibber. And before they got there, he decided he was going to turn around and go back, and they got married, and he joined the family in Missouri later on. He was a surveyor, guide, hunter, and he was a soldier. He spent most of his adult life in the U.S. Army. He did not retire until 1853, and he was in his 70s, and he dies in 1856. So imagine that life back then, but he was in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the Mexican War. So a very dedicated soldier. And he was actually one person that knew his father, I should mention. He was much younger than all of his siblings. So he actually got to know his father because his father spent more time at home. And later on, he would, Lyman Draper would interview, as I mentioned before, and he gave great information. So once again, the beautiful Boone's Lake country. And I still can't figure out, for some reason in Missouri, they dropped the E on everything that's named after Boone. He could write his own name. I don't know why. I haven't been able to figure that one out. But you start to see this myth, especially in Missouri, about all the things that Daniel Boone did. But they mention it here, the Boone Lake Trace, and there's also a salt lick I'll talk about, which they named after Daniel Boone, but it was actually Daniel Morgan Boone and Nathan that did it.
And on that sign, it shows the E on the Boone there.
Yeah, it's really
Okay.
funny. But Booneville is a town named after Daniel Boone without the E, and you see Boone's Lick without the E.
Huh.
But Daniel Boone is spelled. I can't figure out why they dropped it. So this is the Boone's Lick Trail. Daniel Morgan and Nathan found a salt lick here in Howard County up in this area in about 1804, and they started to make salt and bring it back to St. Charles and send it down the river to St. Louis. And later on, this was called the Boone's Lick Trail from St. Charles all the way to Old Franklin. And then in Old Franklin, the Santa Fe Trail actually started. So people would come to St. Louis, take the Boone's Lick Road, and then hit the Santa Fe Trail from points west. But it was actually Daniel Morgan and Nathan that used that trail. And here's Boone's Lick. But this one is actually spelled with an E on the marker. But once again, we see the myth of Daniel Boone. This is Howard County. This is Boone's Lick. And it says, Boone's Lick, discovered by Daniel Boone in 1804. It's actually Daniel Morgan Boone. And there's really no evidence that Daniel Boone actually even visited the salt lick, but he gets the claim for finding it. And this is Boone in Missouri. So they came to St. Louis. They left in September of 1799. And by October, he walks into St. Louis. And the family travels, and they settle in this area called the Femme Osage Valley. And I've got some neat photos. And he's buried here in Charette, or was. We'll talk about that. Here's the Boone's Lick, Fort Osage. This is where Nathan Boone was often stationed. And later on, Nathan would move to southern Missouri outside of Springfield. So the Boones were all over Missouri. And here's the deed signed between the Spanish official Don Zenon Trudeau, Daniel Morgan Boone, and Daniel Boone. And it states that each man would get 600 arpents. So they moved there in 1799. The Spanish really liked Daniel, so they make him what they call a syndic, or a county magistrate.
When you talk to the picture board, it's really hard.
Sure. Yeah, I wish the microphone worked.
Yeah.
But, so yeah, he becomes a county magistrate for the Femme Osage area. And so anytime there's disputes between neighbors, land claims, things like that, they would go to his house and speak to him. And he would make the actual ruling, and if not, he would send on to court in St. Louis. And this is the Femme Osage, and it looks very much what it looked like when he was there. It's still a very rural area. And here's a great map of all the different plots. Most of the family went west to Missouri. A few stayed back in Kentucky, but most of his sons and daughters, those that were still living, went with him. And his claim is right here. You can see Daniel Morgan here, but down near the Missouri River. And then some problems arise. 1802, the Spanish give the Missouri Territory to the French, and then 1804, the French sell it to the United States. But this is the famed judgment tree. Supposedly, if you had a claim or had to go in front of Daniel Boone, they had a judgment tree in his son's yard that you would go, you would sit down, and he would listen to you both state your cases, and then make a ruling. And this is the Nathan Boone home, started in about 1803. It's a beautiful stone home. But as you can see from the sign, it's now it's owned by a university, and it's a historic site, a private historic site, and they're building this huge frontier village there. But it's become the Daniel Boone Home and Heritage Center. He did live there, but it wasn't his home, it was Nathan Boone's home. And you can see the big sign that says Defiance, Missouri, home of the Daniel Boone house. And it mentions here that he built the 5 walnut fireplaces inside the house. I don't know if that's true or not, but he did live there, and he eventually dies there in 1820. We do know that. And also this time, like I mentioned before, he's a rock star, and people start to hear that Daniel Boone's in Missouri. In 1811, he actually shows up in the newspaper, and they're describing this small settlement on the Salt River. And he's this father figure for everyone that lives in the area. You know, Daniel Boone's the one in charge. If you have problems, you go see Daniel. And this plagues him for the rest of his life, the last 20 years there. Some things to note, I mentioned the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. 1805, 1806, Simon Kenton actually makes a trip west to see Daniel. It's the last time they've seen one another. And I mentioned before the property, once again, property and land issues follow Daniel Boone in Missouri. In 1805, the United States set up a land commission, and you had to show that your land in Missouri or the Louisiana Purchase was cultivated and improved. He didn't do either. He ended up living with all of his children, and he did not do anything. So in 1809, this U.S. Land Commission says, you know, you don't own the land, you never did anything to it, so he loses the 1,000 arpents, or the 800 acres that he has in Missouri. 1810, 1811, he travels to the upper Missouri. Some families speculate he went as far as Yellowstone, but you have to think at this point, he's 74 years old. Did he really get to the Rocky Mountains? I do know he went as far west as Fort Osage. There's actually a newspaper article from 1816 saying that he had just visited. So he was still traveling, still hunting. Sadly enough, Rebecca dies in 1813, and she's the first person they think buried in the Bryan Cemetery in Missouri. Finally, in 1813, the U.S. Congress takes up an act of relief for Daniel Boone. They hear that he had lost this land, and so a representative puts forth a bill. The House and Senate approve it in December of 1813, and then in 1814, President James Madison signs the bill, and he's given back his 1,000 arpents of land in the Missouri Territory. But sadly, he sells it off by 1815 to pay taxes, and also people in Kentucky who had claims against Boone hear that he has land in Missouri, so some of them supposedly come west to see if they can claim what he owes them. I mentioned a visit in 1816 to Fort Osage. In this famous painting, this is Chester Harding, who was based out of St. Louis. He goes in June of 1820 to see Daniel Boone and to paint his portrait, so we actually get an idea of what Daniel looked like the last year of his life. And this is the act of relief. And you can see where it actually states that Daniel Boone's act of relief was signed into law by Madison. So he's in the congressional record. And I mentioned before, you know, stardom, what that brings, early groupies, but this is a letter or diary entry from July of 1819 from a gentleman that lived in Missouri with a steamboat pilot, and so they're going up the Missouri, and they decide to stop in July to see Daniel Boone. And it's a great description. If you go down a bit, they stop and they find a young man and they ask, can you go get Daniel Boone? We'd like to meet him. So Boone comes to the riverbank, makes his appearance, and so they fire off 4 rounds from a 6-pound cannon. So you think about that, by the 18 teens, the steamboats and people heading west, all these people wanting to stop and see him, how tiring it would be, especially his age. And then Bush's brother, a couple months later, does the same thing. This time it's May of 1820. He's going upriver in a steamboat, and they stop to see if Daniel Boone will come down and wave to people on the steamboat, but this time he does not make an appearance. Lewis and Clark actually went by the Boone settlement, but they did not stop to talk to Boone. It's noted in one of the diaries that they passed the Daniel Boone settlement. But you can see by 1820, he's a man and a hero. So September of 1820, Daniel was very sick, and he's at Nathan Boone's home, which we saw before. And this is a description of his death by Nathan. And he's 86 years old at this time, September 26, 1820. Here's his obituary from the St. Louis newspaper. I mentioned he discovered Boone's Lick country. Colonel Boone was a man of common stature, great enterprise, and strong intellect. And in his memory, the Missouri General Assembly wears black crepe on their sleeves for a month. And it's interesting here because it mentions that he went all the way, all the way up to the Grand Osage River and went west to Arkansas. So you start to see those stories about how far he may or may not have actually explored at his age. And so he's taken to Marthasville, Missouri, to the Bryan Cemetery where Rebecca's buried, and this is where he's buried. You can see the sign up front. You can actually drive here and visit it. It's private property, but it's actually a grave. The cemetery is open to the public. And to give you an idea, here's St. Louis, and there's Marthasville, and it's still a really rugged area. There isn't much out there. It's hard to get to, and it looks really probably the same as it did when he was there. And here is a description of his funeral. Nathan Boone's son-in-law did the funeral itself. And he's about a mile below Charette Creek on the elevated second bank of the Missouri, about a mile from the river. And this is what the marker now looks like. And we'll talk about this marker. But the question is, we're going to answer two questions today. Who's buried in Boone's grave? And where are they buried? So here's the marker now, and sadly about 5 or 6 years ago, vandals took off. There was one that had been put on around 1913 or so, and they peeled off the copper signage, and this is brand new. And you can see there's a clue here, removed to Frankfurt. So in 1844, there's a group of guys in Frankfort, Kentucky that decide they're going to start a cemetery. It's the second cemetery in the United States to be incorporated. They buy 32 acres and it later grows to 100 acres. And I believe there are like 22,000 burials there now. But in order to get people to want to buy a plot in your cemetery, sometimes you have to come up with an idea to get people there. Frankfurt at that time had about 1,900 people, and this is a gazetteer from about 1844 that describes the town. 1,900 people or so. The penitentiary is there. I find this amusing, the income of which exceeds its expenses, so it was very profitable for the penitentiary. Churches, a courthouse, and some businesses. Here's an 1871 map of Frankfurt. You can see where the state capitol is in downtown. You can see down the bed of the Kentucky River where they put in the cemetery. And these are the cast of characters that are involved. Very powerful men from the early history of Kentucky. Mason Brown and Orlando Brown. Their father was John Brown, who was a Virginia senator that put forth Kentucky statehood and then became Kentucky's first senator. Mason Brown was a judge and would later be a Kentucky Secretary of State. His brother would also serve as Secretary of State and own the Commonwealth paper in Frankfurt. John J. Crittenden, U.S. Senator, U.S. Attorney General. His son, Thomas J., was a Civil War general and the state treasurer for Kentucky. Robert Letcher was also a Kentucky governor and served in the House of Representatives and later on would be a minister to Mexico. And then Preston Loughborough was an adjutant general and the first U.S. postmaster. And what's interesting, all these gentlemen are buried in Frankfurt except for Preston Loughborough. He actually had a mental breakdown in 1852 and moved to his sister's farm in Missouri and died. He's buried in Clay County, not far from Daniel Morgan Boone. So sort of ironic in a way. And also the Schwagers, two brothers, businessmen. One was the first mayor of Frankfurt after it was incorporated. So they come up with this idea for a cemetery, and on your left you'll see an image of what they wanted the cemetery to look like. And I took an aerial shot from Bing just the other day. And where the circle is, the green circle and the arrow, that's what they call Boone's Grove. You could actually buy a plot in Boone's Grove to be buried near the hero, and that's how they sold it. And what's neat about this is actually it pretty much matches the original drawing. And there must have been wind in Missouri about the possibility of this Boone's Grove, because this is March 27, 1845, and somebody in the Missouri House of Representatives puts forth a bill to actually put a memorial or a stone on the Daniel Boone and Rebecca graves in Marthasville. It passes the House, it goes to the Senate, and the Senate votes it down. So Missouri decides they're not going to spend any money to put a memorial on the grave. And about this time, all these guys in Kentucky are writing letters to the Boone family. Nathan is the only one that's still surviving, but 1845, he's actually in the Oklahoma territories. It was Indian territory then. He's at Fort Gibson, which is outside of Muskogee. And so they're mailing him letters, but to imagine a letter getting to St. Louis and then going out to, points west. He may or may not have received these letters. But I love the way they're written because, they talk about Daniel Boone, the first great pioneer, and how he sleeps with his companion in a retired village of Missouri, far away from the land of his fame. And these letters are great. They all go on and on like this. And here's another one about the committee. And they really want Daniel and Rebecca to come back to Kentucky. On July 3rd, 1845, this is a newspaper out of Jefferson City, and it mentions that Colonel Richmond had put forth this bill that failed. And this is actually the first mention that Boone may be leaving the state of Missouri for Kentucky. And you can see it must be a source of regret to all that his remains are to be removed. But they understand that consent of his family has been obtained for the removal. And then the article goes on. I find this really interesting. It mentions a letter from Nathan Boone to this committee stating that he was okay with the removal. But if you read like Lyman Draper's interviews with Nathan Boone, he doesn't speak like this. And I don't really believe, he's in Indian Territory and there was a problem with the Creek Indians, so he was very busy with the military. I don't know if he ever got the letters or had the time to actually respond, but supposedly the newspaper had a copy of the letter. And this is my 6 degrees of separation of Daniel Boone, because it is very confusing. So you have Daniel up in the upper left-hand corner. George Boone was his brother. Well, they find out there's a William L. Boone living in Shelby County, Kentucky, which is the grandson. At that point, he's in his 70s. The committee contacts him and said, can you help us negotiate with the family in Missouri to bring Daniel back? And he says, sure, I'll help out. Well, he's related to Jesse and Nathan Boone. Those are 2 of Boone's sons who were still living in the 1840s. They can't get a hold of Nathan. They can't get a hold of Jesse, but they find 2 of Boone's granddaughters, Harriet Boone Bobber and Panthea Boone Boggs, who incidentally is married to Lilburn Boggs, who is a former governor of Missouri. They're both in Jefferson City, and they give the okay to have his remains removed. So it's the 2 granddaughters that tell the committee, yes, you can take our grandparents' remains back. So July 17th, 1845, Thomas J. Crittenden, one of the Schweigerts, and William Linville Boone travel to Marthasville. They meet with the family, and they have some men dig up the remains to remove them. And here's a description of August 7th, 1845, so about 3 weeks after the actual event. And you can see how it ends. What must be dear to the society, a treasure, and to Kentucky, a prize of inestimable value. But they delivered speeches. I guess he gave a very eloquent speech to the family.
Did they move Rebecca as well?
They did.
Okay.
They did. And back before Twitter and social media now, when somebody gets arrested or there's an event, we hear about it like 30 seconds after it happens. But back then, it took several weeks. If you look at the dates of the editorials of the newspaper, by the point these actually hit the St. Louis newspapers, Boone is already back in Kentucky. So these are 3 different editorials to different newspapers in Missouri. Actually, the bottom one is from Louisville, and his response, somebody has been reading the St. Louis newspapers. They're very angry that Boone has been removed. And the letter right there, it just goes on and on. It's really great. He's really upset. And then local papers are looking about registered in Kenton County. In Covington, this is a description that they were brought on the 23rd. It's now August. And they mentioned Colonel William Boone and everybody that went to speak. And you can see Boone's Grove is where he's going to be buried. And then a Frankfurt newspaper talking about the actual funeral is going to be September 13th of 1845, that he and Rebecca are going to be buried in Boone's Grove. And I love the newspapers because they're claiming that the Kentucky River was their favorite stream.
Did you take that picture?
I did not. I got it from the Frankfurt Cemetery Facebook. And they actually put out an order. They had a procession. They had a parade. They asked all businesses in Frankfurt to close for the day in memorial to Daniel and Rebecca. And this is the program. And they actually had 21 different sections within the parade. Number 1 was the military with a band. the pallbearers in the hearse, relatives and companions. Number 5 is the president of the Frankfurt Cemetery Committee. And then my favorite's number 20, strangers and citizens and carriages. And then number 21, strangers and citizens on horseback. Back in Missouri, this is a description of the funeral, October 2nd, 1845. So it takes about 2 weeks for the news to get west. But they say that about 15 to 20,000 people showed up for the funeral. And at this point, Frankfurt has about 2,000 people. So imagine what a little town like that was like with another 20,000 people showing up for the day. They mentioned that every county in Kentucky was represented, but also many of the western and southern states have representatives as well. And they were drawn in by four white horses in a carriage decorated with evergreens and flowers. And once again, the flowery language, he and his companion were lovers of the green woods and the wildflowers. And here's some images of early funerals and I couldn't find a 4-horse carriage, but there's a 2-horse carriage. So Larry and Gordon Boone drove in September of 1845. And here's another description because John J. Crittenden comes and gives a speech. And I love this description that is subject all the fascinations of his peerless fancy and unrivaled oratory. And when he ceased to speak, the listeners stood fixed to bore, so he just mesmerized all 20,000 people with his speech. And then it goes on to say that he now reposes in own beloved Kentucky, and that we're all united to have him honor, and generation after generation will make their pilgrimages to his tomb. And boy, do they. Here's Boone Day in 1925, and you can see the monument in the background. And part of the deal was the cemetery would put a monument over his grave, but it's not till 1860 where the Kentucky General Assembly approves money to put a monument. So for 15 years, he does not have a monument where his grave is. And so they put forth $2,000 to build this monument. And I mentioned the pilgrimages before. This is a Civil War letter from a Missouri soldier who was stationed with the Union Army in Frankfurt, and he describes going to see the grave of Daniel Boone, the great hunter and Indian warrior. And he describes the Kentucky River Valley. And then he mentions the monument with the engravings, but at the very bottom, he didn't take any part of the monument, but a lot of other soldiers and visitors started taking pieces of the monument with them. But he mentions he enclosed his friends some evergreen branches that were growing nearby. So you start to see him writing the actual people of taking things from the cemetery and memorial field. And Missouri being Missouri, you think the General Assembly here moves slow. 1897, the Missouri General Assembly actually votes and approves money for a monument in Marthasville. So this is 50 plus years later that they actually approved money to build a monument on a grave that's now empty in Missouri. And they approved $1,800 to build that monument you see in the photo. But at the same time, we have problems here in Kentucky. I mentioned a lot of vandalism. This is an 1896 newspaper article on the left that talks about the grave is sadly neglected. And this is actually a postcard I found from 1907 that is printed at the top, defaced by relic hunters. So we can see the evidence. You can see the path that people have worn around the grave. But fortunately, in 1906, the Rebecca Bryan Boone chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, which was based out of Fort Thomas in Campbell County, actually here in Campbell County, decided to raise money and awareness. They were trying to educate people that this grave of the great pioneer needed to be fixed. They not only get money, that they raised money, but also the Kentucky General Assembly also gave them money, and they hired Henry Farney, an artist from Cincinnati, to help restore the project. And then in May of 1910, the chapter got together in Frankfurt, and they had a memorial service, and they dedicated the brand new monument, or the redone monument. And Miss Fanny Bell of Newport actually was the one that did the dedication. And that's what the monument looks like today. And you see they put the fence in to keep people away from the grave. But of course, this has been ongoing. I've been trying to track it back, but around the early 20th century, the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, Boone descendants of Missouri started claiming that they actually did not dig up Boone, that they misled them, and they may have taken a slave's body back, and that they still have the body in Missouri. I've seen correspondence between like a Missouri governor and a Kentucky governor about in the 1950s about the Boone grave. So it's ongoing, and you can see there are newspaper articles. In the 1980s, the state anthropologist, when they brought him back, what was left of his skull, they did a plaster cast. In the 1980s, the state anthropologist for Kentucky said, well, I don't know if it's Boone or not. And then in the 1990s, Dr. Emily Craig, who's a noted anthropologist and was a state anthropologist for Kentucky, came out and said that the cast was done so badly you could never tell who it came from, and that DNA testing would be needed. But in Missouri, the newspapers, I do a search every couple weeks to see what pops up, and these are from 2012, from all the different newspapers about the grave. They actually have a Friends of the Boone burial site in Missouri. That they're a nonprofit. They incorporated themselves in 2008 to bring awareness to the grave there, and they have a website all about the history of Boone, and they dispute whether or not he's actually here. I found this in a Spokane, Washington newspaper. This is 2005, but you could buy the Griswold Farm and the Boone Bryan Cemetery for $1.2 million. Somebody did buy it, but the cemetery is still open to the public. And these are the two different graves. Personally, I like to think that Boone is everywhere. He's part of us. He's part of our history. And what's, as I mentioned, Boone is everywhere. Kentucky has over 100 place names named after Daniel Boone, and Missouri has 60 plus. Daniel Boone, if you're on Facebook, Daniel Boone now has a Facebook page if you want to friend him. But you can see Boone Drive, Boone Street, the Boone counties. I found some obscure ones. In Missouri, where I lived, we actually had the Daniel Boone Little League. In Kentucky, there's the Daniel Boone Family Health and Skincare Clinic. So I think Boone would really have a problem with all the name recognition. Thank you. I'll take questions, but real quick, let's see if you can listen to me. Well, I'll take questions when this pops up over here if that's quite the same. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
My brother lives in Boone, North Carolina. Do you know, was that a son, you think?
They actually lived in North Carolina.
Okay.
Yeah, he came from Pennsylvania to North Carolina and then west to Kentucky.
10 children, do they know present-day descendants of any of them?
Yeah, there's actually a whole website now that descends to Daniel Boone.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and there are lots of them because Daniel, I believe he was one of 10 or 11, and then all of his siblings had 10 or 11 children, and then he had 10 children. I mean, it's just amazing. Each one of their children that survived had multiple children. Yeah.
Any plans to exhume the body for DNA testing?
I haven't seen anything yet. Yeah. If you want to start the petition, I'll move on. Yes, sir.
What's the highest rank that Nathan Boone attained?
He was a major, and towards the end of his life, they made him a colonel. He had health issues towards the end in order, I think, to get him more money. But sadly, I just read the other day, they didn't offer retirement back then, so in 1853, they bumped him up to colonel to try to get him more money in order to give him money to live on. He was very sick in 1853 and would die in 1856. Any other questions?
I read back years ago in an old encyclopedia from 1954 that somebody who had examined the cast in the skull, he thought it may have been from an African American.
That was the gentleman in the 80s, the anthropologist, and then it was disputed because in the 1990s, the other anthropologist said the cast just wasn't big enough to make a determination. I guess it was just on the frontal part of his skull. It was really small. Yes, sir.
About 7 miles southwest of the Woolwich battlefield, there's a little old cabin on private property. There's a sign along, I think that's around 68 or 62. That it was Daniel Boone's last home in Kentucky before leaving. Do you know if that's authentic or just
He was up-
supported by rumor?
Yeah, probably rumor. He was up in the Little Sandy. He was on the Big Sandy for a while. He was in modern-day West Virginia, and then they came back to the Little Sandy in Greenup County.
Yeah, it could have been true because he had a salt lick in Daysland. He was boiling salt, so probably where the house was.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So, who wants to hear Fess Parker? That's Oh, yeah.
Daniel Boone was a man, just a big man, with an eye like an eagle, all in the mountain was he. Daniel Boone was a man, just a big man, he was brave, he was good, he was hot, from the king cast on the top of old and to the eagle his rawhide shoes. The frontier ever knew. There's a big man, and he fought for America to make all America free.